after my last talk, which of course was about football, someone asked me what I thought the best basketball team, what basketball team was the greatest in Windham history. Well, I thought I had answered that 2 years ago when I talked about the 1931 Windham Yellow Jackets girls basketball team with Coach Ray Hilty. That team featured Gladys Snyder, who was arguably the greatest athlete, male or female, that Windham, Ohio ever produced. That team won everything there was to win in Northeast Ohio, even challenging much larger Twinsburg, the only other undefeated team in this area, to a postseason showdown to determine who the best team in Northern Ohio was. They whipped them. 13-12, they whipped them. But if you missed that talk about the girls' basketball teams, and you want to know more about that team, I guess you're going to have to wait for the book. A lot of you heard me say that before. Besides, I hate basketball. I've hated it ever since 7th grade tryouts. Coach John Lowry pushed a rack of basketballs at me. Now, I thought he wanted me to show him this flashy hook shot that I developed in backyard games with Bob Chalker and Bruce Honnebach. Instead, he told me he was glad that I'd showed up, and he thought and I remember his exact words, he thought I'd make a darn fine manager. Where are you, John? You damaged my psyche. You're going to get my therapist bills. Oh, there he is, right there. Now, I realize that hating basketball makes me a heretic in Windham. And sooner or later, I'd have to confront this dilemma and start researching the entirety of Bomber basketball history just to honestly answer that one simple question that I've been asked. And what I've discovered might take a few of these talks, because there's some awfully solid contenders, some of which have become dim memories over the years. And I'm not sure I can even whittle it down to a single team, because Windham has had entire eras of basketball brilliance. So tonight I'm going to make a start by recalling 3 coaches who built teams of genuine greatness. Yes, there was basketball in Windham before Marty Hill arrived. Boys basketball began in Windham in 1927. The new brick high school had just replaced the 1883 wooden building that sat where the student parking lot is today. So when the Yellow Jackets, which was the team nickname at the time, took the floor, they were playing in the most modern gym in the county, one on which the foul circles almost overlapped. And they were playing against Manaway Village, the defending county champions. On December 19th, 1927, in their very first game ever, the boys team, featuring my great-uncle Willis Belden at center and Bob Ayersman at guard, scored 5 points. Manaway Village scored 92. Over 80 years later, it remains the most lopsided game in the history of Portage County. The Windham boys basketball team did not win a single game for exactly 4 years. They lost 41 games in a row. So I guess we have to start our search somewhere else. The 1930s were not a shining time for Windham sports, except for the girls' basketball team, which dominated the county for the entire decade. The football teams were often so pathetic that they were disbanded halfway through the season. The basketball teams were a little bit better, but never more than mediocre. No one foresaw things getting any better until six-man football came to town in 1938. Because that was the sport at which Windham would excel, becoming the Ohio State champions in 1939 and 1940, and the international champions in 1940 when they defeated the best team in Canada. Finally, Windham had a crew of kids who were good athletes, And the winning spirit they fostered on the gridiron spilled over as those same kids donned their black and gold basketball uniforms. Now, the fall of 1939 was an uneasy time, both at home and abroad. Hitler's Nazi army had conquered Poland in October, the prelude to World War II. The Ravenna Evening Record headlined a story about a Randolph farmer whose pigs had trampled him to death in a feeding frenzy. James Naismith, the inventor of basketball, passed away. But Garrettsville High School had opened its shining new 65 by 42-foot basketball court, and the Windham boys, still glowing from their undefeated six-man football team, were ready to play for their new coach. His name was David Thomas. Now, the younger people in this room have never heard of David Thomas. A few of you older folks might have bought insurance from David Thomas. And at least some of you know that Dave was the husband of Catherine Thomas, the legendary teacher and principal after whom Windham named this very school. Over on the other side of the county, Dave is vaguely remembered as a math teacher at Southeast High School. But very few people know that this mousy little math teacher was the first-grade basketball coach in Windham history. He inherited from football coach Dean Everwine a spectacular group of athletes, kids who would have been superstars in any era of Windham athletics. On December 13th, 1939, against Nelson, he started Fred Stanley, Harold Stanley, and Bob Turner, each of whom would be first-team All-American football players the next year. Completing that quintet were the versatile Sam Scott and Ralph Drumheller, a bruising all-conference football player and the only senior starter. Backing them up were Robert Fector, George Love, Kenny Nichols, Don Miller, and Robert McDivitt. And despite being eager to translate their football success onto the hardwood, they lost 3 of their first 5 games, every one of them a Portage County League loss. Maybe it was because they were playing for a new coach who had the position forced upon him. Corwin Gehrig, the previous coach, had moved on, and Superintendent Everwine had few male faculty members on his staff. So a man who preferred working with numbers to coaching basketball players got the position by default. And the very vocal Dean Everwine was hardly a role model for Dave Thomas to follow. Everwine had taught his football players to fight back on the field. He frequently got angry and yelled at the boys. That wasn't Dave Thomas's style. He was a very shy man, and he didn't even really know how to raise his voice. In fact, Fred Stanley recalls that Dave actually was very polite with his players when addressing the team, treating his players with deference. But if he wasn't a rabble-rouser, he did have a keen analytic mind, an abundance of patience, and an understanding of the fundamentals of basketball. Where Gehrig, a former football coach, had simply rolled the ball out onto the practice court and had the players scrimmage, Thomas's philosophy was that organization would lead to success. He watched each player's style, he figured out their weaknesses, and he worked with them one-on-one. He'd stay hours after practice, late into the evening, working with individuals on their shooting form and grounding them in the basics. He helped Fred Stanley develop a hook shot from the foul line that was a showstopper in those days of two-handed set shots. Now, this mild-mannered man had decided that if he had to coach, he wanted the best team on the floor. He didn't care what year a boy was in school. If he was the best player, even a sophomore, he's in the game. And gradually, the players began to respond and to win. After losing to Streetsboro, Freedom, and Hiram by a total of 7 points, the boys entered January 1940 with something to prove. Thomas kept tinkering with his lineup, finally settling on Sam Scott at center, Harold Stanley and Nip Drumheller at forward, and Bob Turner at point guard, a continuation of his role as the quarterback on the football team.